Brilliant. Thanks so much. Got it. Also, I'd just like to acknowledge Kelly and Nathaniel as well from the Humanitarian Advisory Group for their help in putting this event together, as well as my colleagues in development studies here at the University of Melbourne. What I'll do now is actually just sort of run through the panelists this evening, tell you who is here and what their experience is, and then I'll sort of move into a framing of the discussion tonight. In a certain sense, what are our goals? What are we trying to consider in this discussion? And that will actually lead to the first of our questions. So our first panelist tonight is Thenu Herath, the CEO at Oaktree. She is, if you are unfamiliar, Oaktree is Australia's largest youth international development agency. Her team oversees youth empowerment and leadership projects across the Asia Pacific that allow young people to have a voice in shaping their communities. I won't read through all of these slides here. You can obviously read some of these yourself, but I'm just trying to highlight what I think are some of the key takeaways or the key things to keep in mind as you engage with our panelists this evening. She's also previously worked at World Vision, Teach for Australia, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs, while completing studies in politics and law. And thank you, Thenu, for being here with us this evening. I'll go through the entire panel here, and I suppose it's not quite the right environment for a round of applause to welcome everybody here, but if I should start by saying I'm really grateful for everybody for their participation tonight. Kelly Durant works as External Relations Director for the Marie Stopes International Australia. She has been the External Relations Director at MSIA for over 15 years, where they focus on issues of health and gender equality in development. MSIA is a member of the MSI Reproductive Choices Global Partnership, which provides comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care across 37 countries. I think it's also important to point out that Kelly leads MSIA's strategic engagement with the Australian government and is responsible for project design, policy, partnerships, fundraising, and communications in the Asia Pacific region. She also has a master's in public health from Monash University and a Bachelor of Arts and Science from the University of Melbourne. And in 2020, she co-chaired the International Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Consortium and has experience working in various countries with NGOs, academic institutions, and the United Nations. Finally, the third member of our panel this evening is Alice Ridge, Senior Research Policy and Advocacy Advisor for International Women's Development Agency. Alice is Senior Research, well, as you know, to give you some background on what the International Women's Development Agency does. They are an Australian-based organization that works with global feminist movements to advance our vision of gender equality for all. Alice leads the IWDA's Advocacy on Feminist Foreign Policy, funding for women's rights organizations, and international development. I think it's also pertinent to point out that prior to joining IWDA, Alice worked with the Australian Council for International Development and is currently the co-chair of the AHCFID's Gender Equality Community and Practice. So as you can see, we have a diverse but also very experienced panel this evening to talk through some of these questions. Now, I will stop sharing my screen here in a second, but I just want to sort of draw your attention to some upcoming events. Some, just in the next month here, and then also in October. This is what we have coming up over the rest of the semester. And as we get closer to those dates, of course, we'll be sending out reminders for how to participate with those. And who knows, maybe we can even do them on campus. But at this point, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we can come back together as a sort of as a collective here. Again, as Beth mentioned, if you feel comfortable and are able to, we'd love it if you turn your video camera on. It just makes it feel a little bit more human. If you can't or are not wanting to do so, that's fine, of course, but it helps add to the experience, I think, if we're all sort of sitting here on our Zoom. When we put together this session this evening, I would say our goals they're broad, but they're also meant to address some of the questions that we actually discuss in the classroom, and that many students wonder about as they enter the workforce, let's say. And this a crucial issue, I think, that often comes up in the classroom that frankly I am unable to answer because I don't work in development practice as such, as what are the real differences in a certain sense that we see between some of the debates and questions that we raise in the classroom from researchers and from activists and from community groups, and in this case, particularly around feminist approaches and feminist critiques, to what we might sort of call the quote unquote real world, people actually working in development. How do they actually engage with these critiques? How do they, what are the insights, or perhaps some of the, the inspiration or ideas that they draw from feminist approaches or feminist critiques? And what are some of the real limitations that they face? And I think that this is something, the purpose of this event tonight is to help provide some of that context that, frankly, myself in the classroom, I'm not actually very well prepared to talk about, because I work in the classroom most of the time. And I think it's really useful to get different perspectives on this, people who are working on both sides of this, so to speak. And I think personally, one of my goals this evening is to begin to sort of interrogate this perceived division between what we kind of call the academic world and the real world. I would argue the academic world is also the real world in all sorts of ways. And I think it's useful to sort of see, okay, what sort of points of differentiation really sort of exist, and what are other places where there's a lot of sort of a passage of ideas and inspiration from both sides. And so I think my first question that I'll open up to the panel, and maybe I'll start with Thenu actually, is this question of, how do you see in your own work, in your own experience, feminist approaches and feminist critiques being engaged with by, in development work, by development institutions? Have you seen what you would say are sort of examples of good practice, or the real limitations or issues that you think need to be highlighted when we talk about this issue very generally? So this is a very broad sort of question to get us rolling, but if you don't mind, then I'll ask you to have first crack at it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. I have multiple thoughts when you ask this question, and I think I'll start with our work internationally in particular. And Oaktree prides ourselves on sort of taking a gender lens to all of the work we do, and ensuring that while we are focusing on young people and youth empowerment more broadly, that there is an inherent intersection between young people and gender in the communities that we work with. One of our flagship programs over the last year was to develop something called the Youth Solidarity Fund. So what we're actually doing is funding grassroots organizations. Currently, our pilot program is in Timor-Leste, and what we are trying to do is really meet youth organizations where they're at, and meet youth movements where they're at, and help them with this original and fundamental stage of getting to the level of being a registered organization. And one of the partners that we had on board for our pilot program was actually a gender equality movement. It was a feminist movement in Timor-Leste. And while it was really, really great to see the ideas coming forth in young people, young women in particular in these communities, ready to fight a lot of the inequalities that were present in the structure of their communities, what we really ran into in our pilot year was the difficulties that arise in working in the field with limited resources. And I think we feel that here in Australia, as much as they feel it overseas as well, the lack of resources that are available for us to invest into turning critiques and feminist approaches into workable, practical and pragmatic solutions is something that we've really had to deal with over the last year in particular. So for us, it's an evolving journey. It's not something that we've actually found a solution to yet, but is something that we're quite actively working on. I think you're on mute, Jeff.
I am indeed on mute. Thank you for that. Next, I guess we'll go over to Kelly. Kelly, same question to you.
Thanks. Sorry, just trying to find my unmute button there. So it's great to be here, and this is a really broad question that's obviously going to start a lot of debate from the beginning. And I think it's really interesting because MSIs work globally. As you mentioned, we're working in 37 countries and have close to 10,000 team members across the world. But our work is almost exclusively focused on women's sexual and reproductive health as a means to progress gender equality. And yet we probably don't talk about taking a gender lens as much as we should. It's almost inherent in the way that we work. And so I would say that actually, as a practitioner on a day-to-day basis, I probably don't engage that much in feminist kind of critiques of development or thinking that much about it from this perspective. So it's really going to be an interesting conversation to, look at the intersection between what you've called the real world and this sort of academic space and how these two things intersect, because I think that work is really vital and it really underpins all of the work that MSI does. But in our day-to-day work, we focus, I guess, on a lot of practical elements of how many services we're providing in what countries and who's accessing those and what percentage of people are young people and what barriers those young people are facing. But we don't tend to necessarily talk about it in the terms that might get talked about in a more academic sphere. So I think I'll probably pass to Alice now, but for me, I just thought it was interesting to frame it like that at the beginning so that we can really see that there's lots of people coming at this from different perspectives.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Alice, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have the opposite answer. I have the privilege of working for a feminist organization, which means that we talk about feminism in our work pretty much constantly. I think it's one of the things I enjoy most about my job is being able to really, nut out like the trickier issues, like how is power playing out in a partnership or in a piece of work that we're doing, a piece of advocacy that we're doing, what are the trade-offs that we're making? Are we staying true to our values? Are we using a message that we think will cut through? Where's the balance between those things? I think, it's something that we really do talk about constantly. And I think that this idea of the kind of real world academic divide is really interesting because I think, as you're saying, academia is part of the world, but there's also a power dynamic in that, which is that academia brings a certain level of power to conversations about who has knowledge, who gets to speak on behalf of different groups, who gets to create knowledge about the world and have it taken seriously, and what format does that live in. So I think that's something that has been a conversation for us in the last couple of years around research and knowledge creation is about sort of breaking down some of those power structures and thinking about what kind of knowledge gets valued and whose knowledge is treated more seriously. So I think it's an interesting, this sort of academia real world is a really interesting dynamic to look at because there's a lot of different power relationships at play. And then, there's also power in the grassroots voice and in the activist voice that, maybe it looks different to the power that academia holds. So I think it's an interesting question.
I think that's actually a great segue into sort of the next general question that I had for people. And Alice, I guess I'll ask you to sort of continue with this as a sort of a great segue. And it's thinking about the power imbalance that exists. It's not just, moving beyond sort of academic questions here, but the power imbalance that exists between development organizations and what we tend to call sort of local communities, or the place where development work gets done, right? And how should development practitioners at the grassroots level genuinely embrace a gender-sensitive model and try to implement these paradigms? And I guess what I mean by this is, can you think of specific examples in your work that has actually worked to produce this? Cases where you thought, hey, you know what, this actually worked really well, and or cases that frankly just didn't work very well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to approach it from the level of principles and then see if I come up with an example while I'm talking. But the two things that sort of come to me, I mean, I think the first thing is the approach that IWDA takes is, we are never going to change gender inequality in another country. As an organization based in Australia, where we're not going to change anyone's mind. It's not really our place to do that, and it's not going to be effective. So the approach that we take is to find the people, usually women, who are leading that work in those countries, who are working within those cultures, who understand the unique dynamics and social norms that are playing out. And we support them to do that work. And so I think that really, it is really about finding the people who are doing the work in those communities, rather than sort of, I think the challenges historically in development have really come when, you know, organizations based in countries like Australia think that they can, that they know better, and they can go overseas and tell people how to do things and say, you're doing it wrong. And I think that you know, more and more we're seeing the deep gender inequalities in Australia coming to the fore. And I think that really highlights the, you know, the problems with that kind of approach of assuming that we have all the answers and other countries need the solutions. So that's sort of the first principle. The second principle, which I guess is a little bit more practical and sort of informs some toolkits that we have, which focus on things like women's economic empowerment or understanding unpaid care, understanding intersections between financial inclusion and empowerment and gender-based violence. And a lot of those tools use sort of question-led approaches, or they're designed to help a group of people talk about how they see gender relations in their community and how they would like them to be different. So, for example, we have a couple of toolkits that use illustrations as the basis for conversations. So there might be an illustration of a man handing over money to a woman, and there's no right or wrong answer, but it's a prompt to have a conversation about, well, what do you see happening in this image? How do you think it reflects what's happening in your community? And how would you like that to change? So rather than going in and saying, you know, oh, well, we think that women don't have enough economic empowerment in this community, it's about allowing people the space to kind of have that conversation themselves.
Oh, that's a really good example. I appreciate that. You know, I don't know if you'd want me to sort of repeat the question, Kelly, to just sort of make sure that that you're on the right path here. But again, considering the sort of the gender imbalances that tend to exist between development institutions and local communities, again, drawing from your own experience, thinking of examples of good practice or potentially of poor practice, what lessons have you learned in your work?
Look, I think I would like to kind of come back to, you know, Alice has kind of given that perspective, which is really fabulous. And, you know, I sort of tried to present that MSI's work is kind of sometimes on the other side of not engaging with these feminist paradigms. But I think what's really important is that MSI is really looking at family planning and sexual and reproductive health as kind of an enabler of gender equality in and of itself. So similar to what Alice has been saying in terms of, you know, it doesn't help to go in and say, this is how we think your country or your community should be living. You know, MSI presents our work in terms of saying, you know, we're giving you the means to make your own choices about your family size. And that then has the flow-on effects often, because we've seen with, you know, research has shown that when people have access to family planning, they tend over time to choose to have less children or to space those children, you know, wider apart. And that ends up producing these gender equality outcomes that we're all aiming for in terms of, you know, young girls staying in school, women being able to hold down jobs, plan their lives, be more economically empowered. So I think giving people the means to make those choices around their sexual and reproductive health does kind of create a power within those communities themselves to kind of have that self-determination. So I think that's the way that, you know, we would try and see our work, is that we're not we're not coming in with this power and saying this is what you should do. We're saying we're trying to work in a way that is offering an opportunity that communities can then choose, or individuals can choose what works for them. Possibly doesn't answer your question though.
No, but and you know, again, it's these questions are meant to be open-ended and meant to sort of allow everyone to speak from their own personal experience and share, I think, you know, what you've learned and what insights you gained in your work. Thenu, same question to you.
Yeah, I'd really like to just echo what Alice said. I'm sure everyone on this call knows Hart's ladder of participation, and for Oaktree, we for a while now have taken that very top approach of like very active participation with the community in terms of reducing that power balance that is really there from an organisation based in Australia and organisations in the community. But recently, we want to take a step further to really ensure that that power balance sits only with the communities themselves. So we don't actually, and this is sort of giving away a little bit of our new strategy, but we're no longer seeing a difference between our domestic work and our international work. We are truly partner focused in the sense that we are partner led. So our partners come to us with proposals for what they think will work within their communities, and we just work with them directly to ensure that they have the funds necessary. There are obviously some compliance issues that come with, you know, being a member of ACFID and things like that, that we need to ensure that we abide by, but otherwise we don't think we know any better than them. And I think that really speaks to the dichotomy between what we can kind of talk about sitting in our ivory towers sometimes about what happens in the academic world and in our critiques versus what really works for communities in person. And I think the approach we take at Oaktree is really to be partner led and to be guided by them.
Thanks. Then, you know, it's interesting because Oaktree being, you know, particularly a group that works particularly, you know, specifically with young people and with youth. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And I mean, you know, in a certain sense, if we think about the power differentials that exist between whatever development workers and local communities, there's also power differentials that exist between older people and younger people and all this. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that work with young people, and, you know, maybe more specifically, how is it then that Oaktree is what we might sort of call a gender-friendly organization, particularly through that work with young people?
Yeah, great. I'll speak to your point about the power dynamics that come with inherently working with young people. And it's quite a personal story for me in particular. I come from a Sri Lankan family, and I'm sure anyone else on the call from a similar region would know that the last thing you want to do is talk up to people older than you. I think you're taught from a very young age to respect your elders. And that's a dynamic that we see across the communities that we work in. And it's a dynamic that is really tricky when it's a lot easier here in Australia to bring a youth voice. It's still not perfect. Obviously, in Australia, there are multiple things that could use from a better youth perspective. But I think that's something to be really aware of, that having a youth voice in the communities that we work in doesn't necessarily look like the same youth voice that we have here in Australia. And really being aware of that power dynamic and working within those constructs in the communities to ensure that young people are still getting a voice, but in the way that suits their communities and their cultural practices. For example, one of our partners in Cambodia was recently invited on National Cambodian Radio to talk about the work that we had sort of pioneered with them over the last year. And to them, that was a huge revolutionary move. It may not seem like that for us, but that sort of elevation of young people in that way starts to shift the power dynamic in society between younger people and, I guess, the ruling older generation, for people to start to see that young people do have something to contribute. And then going to your second part of the question, Jeff, about gender inequality in particular, I'm very similar to Kelly in this regard, that it's not actually something that I think we interrogate as much as we should. And it's something that is a work in progress at Oaktree. I think inherently with our youth participation practices, we also adopt a very gender equal lens to things. But in saying that, it's an area that we need to critique ourselves in a little bit more, because it is really tough for us with limited resources as a grassroots organisation to invest time and energy into really looking through this lens.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Thenu. And that, that leads, I think, to a good question actually now for Kelly. Again, thinking about sort of what are the challenges, what are the limitations that you face, particularly when thinking about issues of sexual and reproductive health. Kelly, in your experience, what tends to be the most common hindrance for women in accessing essential sexual reproductive health services, and what are perhaps some of the differences that you might see across different contexts? And maybe also, if we were to say, okay, we always focus on what are the challenges, what are some of the maybe sort of the key lessons that you've learned in your work that continue to inform the ways that you work today?
Thanks. So you'll have to shut me up because I could talk about this for a really, really long time. But I mean, some of the challenges for women and girls and men and boys to access sexual and reproductive health in some of the contexts where we work, some of them are really simple things like geography. You know, in Papua New Guinea, for example, we work across the whole of the country, and we have clinics in urban areas, and then we have outreach teams, which are essentially sort of 4 people either in a 4-wheel drive or in a boat in PNG, or sometimes in a plane, and they have to go often for 14 days in a row, where they go to one community and then they drive hours through, you know, forests, mud, mountains, the whole thing, to try and get to these remote communities. And even some of these outreach points that we're visiting with our teams, you know, women have had to walk for 2 days to even get to that point. That is 4 days drive for our team to get there. So, you know, physical geographic barriers are still huge. And then there's also, you know, lots of attitudinal barriers. I mean, we have, for different groups, different barriers. So adolescents, traditionally, there's lots of hindrance around attitude that family planning, for instance, is only for married people, and that young people shouldn't be having sex. So that's definitely something. We have lots of providers who still have bias, or there's embarrassment, stigma, shame that prevents lots of young people from accessing services, and just other cultural practices. You know, a lot of cultures still have a preference for relatively large families, or a preference for having sons. And this can put a lot of pressure on women to have children. And often there's a difference between men and women also in terms of what their desired family size might be. And then if, you know, we wanted to come down to some of the sort of structural barriers, things like access to safe abortion is still legally, you know, it's a criminal act in many places, and there's huge legal barriers to accessing those services, which can be really challenging. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty more challenges, but I think in terms of opportunities, there's some really interesting work happening now in terms of some of this has also been sort of fast-tracked from COVID. So there's some really interesting work happening around things like telehealth and providing safe medical abortion using pills rather than a surgical procedure. So that's, you know, has a real opportunity to kind of democratize access when things can be posted, and we can overcome some of those geographical barriers. You know, younger populations generally, people are becoming more accepting of talking about sex, talking about things that were taboo beforehand. And there's lots of opportunities, I think, to work with young people, especially to start to change those kind of, I guess, ways of talking, you know, and to make it acceptable for young people to talk about sex, to allow young women to feel empowered about having discussions around power within relationships, and for them to be more open about their desires to have a career and choose the path that they want to take. So I think, yeah, there is lots of opportunities, but it's a constantly challenging environment that we have to keep innovating to find ways of overcoming these challenges. And I'm sure Alice and Thenu could probably also add examples of this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Well, Alice, you know, that's certainly a question to take. And I would also maybe ask Alice maybe more specifically, I think it's really interesting that in your own work, of course, you take a sort of what we would say a decidedly sort of a feminist approach, and that you're, you know, working carefully with feminist critiques. And I'm wondering maybe in how, if you could just sort of talk me through how it's done. How does the organization do this, right? I mean, how do you sort of discuss, are you being, you know, are you holding yourselves accountable to the critiques or the approaches that are, that you're encountering in the field, and in a certain sense, how it's not just sort of what are the limitations that you face, but what is the process behind? How does the organization actually deal with this and implement it and try to develop what we might sort of call better development practice?
A really interesting question. It's quite hard to describe. And I think the answer is that we talk about it a lot. I mean, I think, we have processes, and we have a lot of toolkits, we have a lot of procedures, we have a lot of, documented things, but I think really where that stuff lives is in the conversation. So, for the staff who work directly with the women's rights organizations that we fund, it's the conversations they have with them about, okay, we've got, we're applying for funding with you from this donor. These are the policies they require. How can we work together to make sure that you've got those in place without kind of, and still making time for the frontline work that you're doing? How are we working together in terms of, the relationship that we have between the organizations? How are, I think a challenge or something that we're trying to overcome is providing more avenues for the organizations that we partner with to give us really honest feedback and to tell us, what they really think about the way that we're working together. And, sometimes they do that in really, really striking ways. I mean, a great example of that, something that we're moving away from, which I'm being very cautious in my language. We've often talked about our partners. And that's really nice language and something that, makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we're doing the work hand in hand. Sometimes that can obscure the power relationship. So something that I found really striking, I was at an international conference with, a staff member from one of those organizations who was introducing me to another person and said, "This is Alice. She works for our best donor, partner." And I thought, oh my gosh, like, we're your best donor. That's great. That's so good. If you think of us as your best donor, that's a huge compliment. Like, but she had this correction of like, no, they like us to call them a partner, not a donor. They don't want to feel like a donor. That's uncomfortable. And so I think sometimes, the way that it plays out is really challenging some of these the things that we want to put in place because they make us feel good about the work that we're doing, and really, being uncomfortable and really sitting with the power dynamics. So yeah, I mean, I think that really happens in the conversations. I guess that's where I'm coming down on that answer.
That's really useful. It's nice to sort of see behind the curtain, so to speak, to see how this work is actually done. I sort of pretty soon here I'll open it up to broader questions from everyone. But maybe, perhaps just sort of one last issue I would raise, and to try and bring this discussion to recent events here in Australia. We've seen how abuses of power can lead to sexual harassment and sexual abuse, frankly, in government and development institutions. And I'm wondering, and this is for all the panel, maybe, I'll start with you, Kelly, is to see how in your own work have you seen that development institutions are able to respond to this and maybe to help prevent issues of sexual harassment and sexual discrimination?
Yeah, look, thanks for that question. We have seen that power, does facilitate these kinds of abuses, and we all want to work to make sure that is, avoided as much as possible. I think if I can speak to the work that we do in this area, we, as recipients of DFAT funding, so we're an accredited NGO and also a member of ACFID, there's a number of policies and procedures that we have to have in place around the prevention of sexual harassment. I don't know the acronym, PSEAH policies. So, we have to do a lot of work on our own policies in that regard, and then working with our downstream partners. So in each of our country programs, we have long-standing partners who are kind of part of the MSI Global Partnership. And so they exist as their own organisations, but as we are passing funding down to them, we have to work with them to make sure that their policies are all in line with these requirements. And as part of that, we also have a really strong kind of internal speaking up policy, which is an anonymous phone call. And there's a number of different ways that people can report anonymously any incidents of anything that they think could be an issue. And that goes to quite independent decision-making committees, and things like that get investigated quite stringently. So I think that's, you know, really helpful to have those things. But it's also just about, coming back to what Alice said, making sure it's part of the conversations and that we're speaking vocally about, you know, our disgust or horror when things like this happen in Australia or in other countries. And so, you know, our team members have a sense that these kinds of things are not accepted or not part of the culture that we want to promote within our organisation. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Alice, I guess Alice, same question back over to you, and then we'll go over to Thenu.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important issue to bring up. Something that I can talk a little bit about in the work I did with ACFID a couple of years ago. I was involved in there was an independent review that ACFID commissioned of the Australian development sector in terms of prevention of sexual misconduct and harassment. And that was conducted by, it was in response to the allegations that were raised in the UK context. And it was really done as a proactive step to, rather than sort of wait for a scandal or wait for something to go wrong or to hit the media, it was a proactive effort to really look at our sector and assume, you know, we probably have the same weaknesses. We might have the same problems that are existing in other parts of the development sector. So we want to understand what they are and think about how we can fix them. So it was run by the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, which seems like a really random choice, but they were actually super well qualified to run this review because they have a research group. They are also attached to the coroner's court, where they have staff who do rape kits. So they're actually, you know, frontline responders to sexual violence and really experienced in working in survivor-centered approaches. And they also have an arm which goes to war zones to do forensic medicine, so identifying bodies. So it's a really, I just say that to explain, it seems like a really weird choice. They actually had a really good understanding of the sector and also the skills to run a review like that really safely and with a survivor-centered approach. So what they did is they sort of looked across the sector at the policy settings that were in place, the compliance requirements, you know, sort of what was on paper. They talked to a whole range of people to try and understand, you know, how does that play out in practice? What are the challenges? What works well? Where are the gaps? There was also a few anonymous mechanisms for people to call or email in with information. So it was quite a comprehensive review. And I think what it really identified was that there were some strengths in the Australian sector. So as Australia's had a code of conduct in place for development organisations since the late 90s, which meant that they were really already ahead of the US and the UK in terms of, you know, a regulatory response to issues. Australia has really world-leading child safeguarding standards in particular, and there was the ability to sort of translate that into the broader PSEA kind of context. The other thing that the review identified is just that, you know, the sector is a product of the broader culture. And when you have gender inequality and these like really big power imbalances between genders in the broader culture, you're going to see that within the organisation. And then when you take people and put them in another country context with power imbalances again, you're going to see some of those challenges. And so what it really came down to was looking at the need to change social and gender norms and work towards gender equality as sort of, you know, the ultimate preventative measure against sexual misconduct.
Excellent, thanks. That's really insightful. And finally, Thenu, same question, over to you.
Yeah, also being a member of ACFID, we're bound by the PACAH policies that are really useful for us to ensure that we are making it from a compliance perspective as risk averse as possible in that area. But in saying that, I think, and I know I've harked on a lot about this, but I think it's really tough in practice when, for example, we don't have an HR department or things like that to know whether we are doing the right things. And I think we're trying to take a really balanced approach to ensure that we are stopping this in the future. And we've got great processes and complaints procedures in place to ensure that independent bodies to review that. But I think it speaks to a broader conversation that we need to have as a sector of, are we putting enough resources into this to ensure that we have our own resources and investing in our own organization, because so much of our focus can be with our partners and the impact that we're making on the ground, that I think it can sometimes put these conversations on the back burner.
That's great. You know, I said it was going to be my final question, but I'm just going to ask one more to the entire panel. But while I do this, I actually just want to encourage everyone, if you have a question, now is actually a great time. You can put it in the chat if you want to, or you know, sort of think about the question or questions that you want to ask. You're more than welcome to ask a question to the entire panel or to one person in particular on the panel. So I'm just sort of, again, cueing everyone, get your questions together. But I want to ask one final question, because I think this is a really useful one, not just for me, but for students as well. To everyone on the panel, you work in a sector that I know a lot of our students would like to work in. And I guess my question to you is, I know you could probably talk about this all night, but if you were to give one bit of advice to students on how to get to where you're at, what would it be? I mean, and I know this is a pretty broad question, this is unscripted, but when you reflect back on something that you learned, or maybe it's something that no one ever, maybe somebody did tell you it specifically, if you're providing advice to people that are completing their degree right now, they're looking, you know, they would love to be where you're at some point in their career. What's something that you know, one or two quick points that you've kind of picked up along the way that you think would be really useful? You sort of wish maybe someone had told you from the start. And then, if you don't mind, I'll actually start with you on this one.
This is a really interesting question. I mean, I feel like a little bit of an imposter on this panel, because I have only been in my role 7 months and I am still very early in my career journey. And certainly I look at Alice and Kelly and think that this is exactly where I want to be in a few years' time as well. But I think for me personally, it was really about just putting yourself out there. Like, I've been volunteering for different NGOs for a very long time, and have had a certain lived experience through some experiences in communities as well. And I think not being afraid to put your hat in the ring, and really knowing that you have something to offer, even if it can seem hard sometimes, with all the gender imbalances and inherent power dynamics that exist within the sector.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Thenu. Alice, over to you.
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I think, you know, there's no one pathway. I think there's many different ways to kind of, that people come into this sector. I think and that's increasing, I think, you know, that even in the time that I've worked in development, I think there's much greater diversity of people in terms of the kinds of career pathways that people have to get here. I think, you know, even 10 years ago, probably the answer would have been go and work in the field, you know, go and do a placement, a volunteer placement, a paid placement, go to another country. And I think I think the localization conversation is really shifting that, which is, you know, great. I think that we're being more critical about that conversation. And what I think that means is that there's just so many different ways to come into this sector. So I think the advice that I would have is sort of be creative about the pathway, you know, take opportunities that seem interesting and pursue things that feel interesting and like a learning opportunity, rather than sort of, I think if having a really strict, you know, well, I've got to do this so I can do this and then this, it kind of limits you in the end. So I think being a bit creative and you know, if you end up in another sector, you might end up in a better job, something cool or something more interesting that you end up liking more, so it's, there's lots of different pathways and there's lots of different places that you can end up, or that you can be at some stage along the way that can be really interesting.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alice. Finally, Kelly, over to you.
Thanks. I appreciate getting to go last. It gave me 2 seconds to try and think about it. I was just kind of reflecting and thinking, what was important for me and the people who I know in the sector and how did they get into it. And it pains me to say that volunteering for an organisation is still a really good way to get into that organisation. Because when roles come up, often you go, oh, what about that person who volunteered with us 3 months ago and did that great piece of work? I hate to say that, because I also feel like volunteer labour of development students is kind of a way that NGOs take advantage of people. So that's not fabulous, but it is often the way that people get into roles. I also think it's really important as a woman, and I'm terrified I'm going to alienate the men on the call now, but I think for me, it's been really important to kind of develop a gang of women who are like-minded and who've helped each other out in our careers. And, I have a number of women who's, I've come into a role that one of them held a few years ago, and we've sort of followed each other or, encouraged each other to go for roles that we might not otherwise have done. So that sort of solidarity and encouragement's been really important. And I think it's really important to find, rather than looking for the job that you want, is to look for the organisation who you ultimately, feel your views align with, and they, because you then find great people within great organisations.
Can I just add on to that, Kelly? I think finding a girl gang is actually really great advice for men as well, because I think in some ways women are really, because there's this sense of like, we've got to work together, we're at a disadvantage, there can be this real camaraderie. And actually my partner doesn't send his job applications to his friends to proofread them, which I was really shocked by, because I've always sent my applications to like a couple of friends to double check and to give me feedback on. So I actually think it's really great advice for men as well, is to like, help each other out, like just.
Yeah. And other people help you have that confidence that you wouldn't otherwise have. Like, there's so many job applications that I've written and sent to a friend, and they've gone back and they've come back with, don't say you contributed to, you bloody let it. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, I guess I did. But, we get so used to saying, oh, my contribution wasn't that big a deal, that actually sometimes it's important to just stand up and say, all right, I'll give it a go. Yeah.
Thank you all. That's really useful. I will now open it up. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have a question, feel free to maybe raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat. And I think it'd be useful to take a few questions and then we'll respond to them and then go for another round. So at this time, please, if questions to the panel or to anyone in particular. Yeah, Rachel.
Hi, Jeff, I have a question. I think this is more specifically directed at Alice, but it's open for everyone. But I was specifically wanting to ask Alice because of IWDA. So firstly, I'm really interested in gender inequality as it relates to disability inclusion and development. And I'm only in the second year of my degree, but I've been writing more papers that are focused on disability inclusion and taking a class on it as well. But I wonder if, and I saw that IWDA in 2016 had a program in Papua New Guinea called Building Capacity and Disability Inclusion. So that's why I was wanting to ask you more specifically. But I wonder if you or any of you think that there's considerable overlap in gender and disability inclusion and development, and in terms of career and also just sort of programs. And I'm also just wondering, like, if you know why there isn't more opportunities that are more more focused on disability inclusion, because I feel like I think that there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of, you know, understanding what marginalized groups need and things like that. And so, yeah, just wondering if any of you have anything to say about that.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. I'll just pause right now before we jump to that. Are there other questions? We can take a few round of questions if there are other questions.
Am I allowed?
Yes, you are. You know what? We'll go Bina, and then we'll go into Nadeem.
I mean, I'd first like to encourage all our students to actually, you know, take the opportunity to ask questions. I don't, of course, yeah, let me just give the way to Felix then. I see Felix has got their hand up.
Hi, I'm Felix. I'm not a student anymore. I was just graduating. Now I'm working for UNICEF. I do have questions. Well, I'm in Timor-Leste at the moment, so hi from Timor-Leste. I have a question for Thenu. Just curious because she mentioned about the feminist movement, which I was part of. I mean, I'm part of. I'm curious to see, like, what was it seem to be a challenge from your side? Like working with the young group here, like sorry, I'm still at the office. Very, very inspiring, very, very, what do you call it, active and dedicated. But I just want to let you know because the movement was created because of this so much restrictions that we face, especially also from coming from UN as donors. So we created that, but we just want to see like how the perception from your side and how what will help, you know, like make it easy. You're right, like we cannot make it legal. In that case, we cannot receive fundings. But these guys are the talented ones, young, you know, people and really influential. And yet, due to certain restrictions from, especially from our side, UNICEF, I'm talking about UNICEF now, it's really difficult. So that's all.
Hi, Felix. Yeah, really great question. And with the thing that I said about a lack of resources from our side, it was really the inability to get the movement off the ground in the context of COVID, because we couldn't from our end fund the movement as much as we would have liked in the context of COVID and having to pivot the programs in that way. But I know for a fact that we're wanting to revisit that in the future, and I know we've had conversations about that before. So I think the actual movement itself it speaks to a broader issue that I think exists about some of the compliance requirements that are required of Australian-based NGOs. For example, like ACFID is great in terms of holding us to account to a certain level of development, but that again, I am not completely sure matches with the needs of communities and movements, especially grassroots movements. Would you agree, Felix?
Yes, very much so. And that's also I'm even like putting on the hats from UNICEF side. It's just so difficult. Like, and what makes it difficult, I sometimes have to like work really behind the scenes because otherwise, if we help, it's perceived to be a conflict of interest because I'm part of the group, and etc. Yeah, it's really difficult. Like this requirement for accountability to be accountable and like where the money goes is just instead of helping, it's just most of the time it's hindering the works here.
Definitely. And yeah, that speaks to a great frustration of mine, especially in the sector here in Australia. The red tape that is required and the bureaucracy does hinder innovation. And Felix, the movement is a clear example of that, like the innovation, passion and inspiration that comes from a youth movement like yourselves, and especially from the gender equality lens. It's unfortunate that things on our end prohibited that from happening. And I think that is a clear indication of how practice and theory don't sometimes allow that intersection.
Thank you.
Yes, very much.
Thank you both. You know what? Why don't we do this? I don't want to forget Rachel's question. So why don't we take Rachel's question and then I'll go to Georgia and then I'll go to Nadeem as well. I believe Rachel's question was sort of pitched directly at Kelly, if I remember correctly. but or I'm sorry,
Alice.
to Alice,
And
yeah.
Alice. Yeah.
But yes, I guess it's also open for the entire panel. So I'll start actually with Alice, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think it's a really great question. I think there is heaps of overlap between gender and disability, you know, as in terms of as forms of marginalization, but also in terms of the kinds of responses that you need to have in place. You know, there are some differences, of course, but I think there are heaps of similarities. I think the lack of focus on disability inclusion, though, is really interesting and concerning, obviously, in the sector. I mean, at I guess a political level in Australia, you know, Australia was during the late 2000s really championed disability inclusion and was really in terms of its development program really world leading in terms of the way that it was integrating a disability inclusive lens into all of its work. You know, I think that's really important work, but I think it's lost some political will over the years, and you know, it's now sort of, we're at a point where excuses get made like, oh, well, there's just too many categories now, or it's too hard to do intersectional work because there's just too many, the list is too long, we can't do that anymore. And you know, I think that's hugely disappointing and presents a really huge challenge. And I think I don't want to present this as like the silver bullet answer, but I think just flipping it around and talking about people, you know, everyone is different. Everyone has different identities, different forms of marginalization, different forms of power, and sort of, you know, I think this sort of perceived fracturing of identities is really, in some ways, I think a strategy to not have to deal with different forms of marginalization and take them seriously. And so I think sort of flipping it around and having that individual focus is really critical in terms of countering that. But yeah, I mean, I think I do think that the feminist movement as a whole still has a long way to go in terms of being disability inclusive. Again, it's that excuse of, well, you know, we don't have the resources, or we're just really focused on gender at the moment. I think often, you know, sometimes that's true, but I think they get used as excuses perpetually to not do that work and to not make the effort to be more inclusive. So I do think it's an ongoing challenge and something that the feminist movement needs to take more seriously. If I can be really cheeky and just say one thing about funding as well. I mean, I think flexible funding is a huge challenge in lots of different movements, and definitely for feminist organizations. AWID did some really great research, you know, over the past like 10 years or so on, you know, the number of women's rights organizations who never received multi-year funding, or who've never been able to cover their costs, or have never received, you know, more than $10,000 or $20,000 in funding at a time. And I think, you know, women's funds are filling some of that gap in terms of, you know, really small grants that can be super flexible. You know, Thenu, you point out some really good challenges in terms of the compliance requirements that are put in place particularly on government funding. But I think, you know, there are some creative solutions that are coming up to sort of respond to those. So it's definitely a huge challenge though.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alice. You know what I may do is just take a kind of a round of questions from the people that I see with their hands up right now. So I'll start with Georgia, and then I'll take a question from Sita, and then I'll take the question from Nadim, and then we'll go back to the panel to answer them. So Georgia, if you don't mind.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you to our panelists this evening. You've all shared some really interesting insights. This is a really interesting and important conversation to be a part of. So I'm glad I was able to click onto my Zoom as soon as work finished this evening from our home offices, as I'm sure we're all joining from tonight. My question sort of touches on this notion around power and power imbalances, particularly between, I guess, those of us who are development practitioners coming from the global north, as we might call it, all of our panelists this evening. I know you're all working for Australian-based organisations. And how do you create space within your work to ensure that feminisms or feminist ideals or priorities that are originating within the context that you're working outside of Australia, how do you ensure that those are able to inform and come into play within your programming? And that might be sort of explicitly, Alice, for you, and maybe Thenu with your kind of more explicit feminist and gender lens work, and perhaps more implicitly Kelly within your work. I think it'd be really interesting to think about this, and then maybe even applying that lens of, you know, localization, or even to go a little bit more transformative into the decolonizing conversation as well. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Georgia. You know, when we answer that question, I actually might ask Kelly to take the lead on that. I think it's really it really speaks to this question. We talk about sexual and reproductive health and the ways that communities respond to these. You know, is this an initiative coming from outside of our community, and how does it speak to this? And so I might ask Kelly to take the lead when we go to that question. Sita seems to have dropped off of my page here. I don't see her, so I'll go to Nadeem and take your question, please, Nadeem.
Yeah, mine is a little broad question. In fact, you know, the issues of power within gender relations, that is the key, and it's a highly political issue, and a highly political issue which is dealt with by development NGOs, which call themselves, and by law in many countries, I think in Australia as well, as non-political organizations. So different, and this has been an issue. So when we on one hand say we are non-political, this means that we have certain restrictions, certain boundaries within which we can work, and that is mainly at the micro level, and when things which are essentially political needs to be addressed also at the macro level. And this has been questioned, which has been faced in different countries, especially, I have experience of developing countries mostly, and NGOs in different countries have sort of tried to address this kind of issue in some way. So I would like to know how Australian, NGOs who are working on these issues have tried to sort of bridge this gap or overcome this kind of, which I think is a certain, hindrance or an obstacle, especially in a culture. And I may be wrong here, that polemical debates are not very much encouraged here in Australia. At least this is my experience, which might be wrong. In fact, I have this feeling that many a time they've been considered pretty uncivilized also. That when you enter into a heated polemical debate over certain essential issues, you are considered not very civilized person. So in this kind of situation, what has women organizations, which are non-profit organizations, non-political organizations, thought of having some strategy individually or collectively of making, transforming this highly political issue at a macro political level, and creating that kind of voice at that macro level?
Great, thanks, Nadeem. Maybe I'll start with Kelly, as I said, if you don't mind, responding first to George's question, and then if Alice and Thenu, if you want to jump in to address George's question, and then we can move on to address Nadeem's question.
Thanks, Georgia. So yeah, I think the power dynamics between ideas that are originating in country. MSI works, I guess, well, in some ways similarly to a lot of traditional NGOs, but in another number of ways. So members of our MSI Global Partnership have been, they're local organisations that have been working in their own communities, in many cases for a really long time. So our main partner in Papua New Guinea, which is Murray Stokes Papua New Guinea, has been working in that country for 15 years. And often those country programs are led by nationals from the countries themselves. They're not full of expats who've come in to work in those countries. There are instances where we have, you know, 1 or 2 expats, but predominantly we're moving to be almost entirely led by nationals who really know their own context and can speak to the communities in ways that they understand, or, you know, talk to the issues and challenges in those specific contexts. So we really do have quite a lot of emphasis on allowing those country programs to come up with their own strategies and their own plans. They drive business planning annually in terms of what their targets are going to be, what things they're going to focus on. And, you know, while there are those power dynamics, obviously, where, you know, there's in the global north, as you say, lots of funding coming from there. I really do think, I mean, certainly within MSI, there's some really powerful, amazing country directors who've been in roles for 10, 15 years and are just absolute powerhouses. And it wouldn't matter what ideas we tried to put onto them. They have their own ideas. And, you know, I can speak to, for example, I was designing a program in conjunction with a number of countries in the last couple of months, but one of those countries was Vietnam, and the country director in Vietnam has been in her role for a long time. And, you know, we were making suggestions about how about we include this, and she's just flat out, no, we're not doing it like that. That won't work. And absolutely pushed back 100%. So I think kind of fostering a culture where, you know, you might argue about certain things in the moment, but ultimately difference in opinion and the ability for people to push back on ideas and have that respected is really the key to evening out some of those power imbalances.
Great, thank you, Julie. Alice or Thenu, was there anything else that you wanted to add in or contribute to this, you know, to George's question, particularly around power imbalances?
I'd love to add something. Thenu, do you want to go first, or I'll go? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. The example that comes to mind for me is a piece of research that we did last year, 2020. Which really we didn't do. We ended up commissioning a Pacific woman to do this research for us. And we wanted to do some research on the role of INGOs like IWDA in global South-led feminist movements, and really try to understand what do global South women see as our place in their movement, if they do see a place for us. And so we had this research led by Ofer Gutenbill-Lecky, who's a, oh my gosh, I'm actually, now I've blanked on which Pacific country she's from, but she's a great Pacific women's rights activist who had really strong networks across the region. And she did this research really, you know, drawing on those networks and relationships to talk to them about what their priorities were for their work and what role they saw for global North actors in that. And I think something that that came out through that research, and which ended up being the title, is this concept of the VAR, which is a concept from Pacific culture. It's a word, again, I'm going to blank on what language it's from because I haven't looked at it in a little while, but it's a word for relationships, but it's, you know, brings a lot of nuance and complexity to that. So it's the space between that people nurture together when they're in a relationship and in conversation. And it's actually focusing on nurturing that space as the starting point for having those kinds of relationships where you can do what Kelly's talking about, where someone can just push back and say, no, absolutely not. That's not useful for us, or that's not going to work. You don't know what you're talking about. So I think that's, you know, it's a concept that we've then sort of gone on to use in other conversations that we've had around our own work and in other parts of our practice around, well, you know, how are we nurturing the VAR in this relationship to make sure that we can sort of have that that robustness. And then can I say something about Nadim's question as well? I think it's a really good question. I think something that we try to differentiate between is, you know, we're a non-political organization in the sense that we're non-partisan. We don't take a side in politics. We don't favor one political party over the other in our advocacy or in our communications, but we're definitely political in the small p sense, in the sense that we talk about political concepts and issues. And, you know, in the Australian context, there's, I mean, charity law is always under fire. It's under fire at the moment, but, you know, there are some protections for that. You're, as a registered charity in Australia, you can't endorse a political party, but you can rate parties on their performance on an issue. So you can say, well, this party's gender policies are this, and this party's gender policies look like this. So you can approach it from sort of concepts and issues that are political in nature. And, you know, a good example of that is quotas for women in politics. It's something that, you know, we talk about in Australia. It's something that our partners advocate really strongly on in their context, particularly Solomon Islands have made some really great progress recently in getting different districts to adopt quotas for women in politics. So, you know, that's an inherently political issue, but it doesn't have to be partisan. So I think that's sort of how we manage that tension.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. That's a useful example. Then, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, again, on the point of the small p political, I think that's a piece that we've been discussing a lot at Oaktree recently. Oaktree was born out of an inherently very political movement to increase aid, and that was what we have been known for so long in the sector and society more broadly. And recently, we have wondered whether we need to return to some of that sort of discourse and really trying to critically analyze how, you know, politics is part of everyone's lives, whether we are politically biased towards one party or not. Everything is political, and a lot of the work we do is political. And I think, like Alice said, it doesn't need to be aligned with one party or the other. It doesn't have to specifically show any biases in that way, but taking a political lens to me is really important, because all of our work is inherently affected by political dynamics, whether they be gender, youth, age, things like that.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the panelists too for finding the links between the two questions there and addressing both at the same time. It makes my job a little bit easier. I see Sita is back, and Sita, I want to go straight to you because it looks as though you're having some trouble with your connection. So we'll go Sita, and then we'll go to Bharti, please.
Hello, this is Sita Giri. I'm from Bhutan and currently working with Humanitarian Advisory Group as regional advisor for Asia. Thank you so much for this presentation, very interesting. And Thenu, Kelly, and Alice, my question to you is, based on your experience, what entry points have you found to be most effective in embedding feminism approaches and development? I've worked mostly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and recently also in Timor-Leste after the cyclone and floods. But it'll be interesting to hear your views and thoughts. And I recall you mentioned, Kelly and also Alice, that the program that you work on doesn't impose on the countries or the programs there. You let the countries kind of decide and support that. That's excellent, and that's the way to go. But I would like to hear from you more on your experience in terms of entry points that has been very effective. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sita. And I'll take a Bharti's question as well before, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you to all the panelists. Really appreciate your time this evening, especially considering if anyone is based in Melbourne, the circumstances we're now in. I work for Save the Children for an Inclusive Education, which is a social enterprise, and I'm currently doing my master's. And so my question actually stems from my master's research last year, And the topic was on the paradox of female economic empowerment. And my question was, can traditional economic development models actually achieve gender equality? And the challenge that so often there's a push for greater participation and treating the as not actually as agents of change, and putting more burdens on them without addressing the attitudinal barriers, so not taking a gender transformation approach. And so often the indicators for success are westernized models of empowerment as well. So my question to the panel is, how do you think we can shift this in development practice when we're kind of stuck in those traditional economic measures? Thanks, everyone.
Great question, Barry. To the panel, actually, and I would, maybe if you don't mind, Kelly, last time I gave you more time. This time I'll give you less time. If you don't mind, Kelly, I'll ask you to take first swing at either one or both of these questions.
Thanks. I might go with Barty's question to start, because I do think that's really, very an astute question. And I mean, for me, on a personal level, COVID has really, really brought this to the fore, because, I work with a ton of amazing women and, country directors in our Timor program, for example, and, lots of people who, are, like you say, empowered in that traditional sense, that they're in, good jobs and have teams of people reporting to them. And then COVID hit and suddenly schools were gone. And a lot of us fell back into this sort of gendered assumption of, why aren't we as mothers helping to educate our children? And, how were our husbands possibly supposed to do all their Zoom calls with the children carrying on in the background and all of that? So I think, we kind of have set a lot of women up with this illusion of this economic model where we go, oh, yes, you have to be empowered and have a job. But that has just meant that we have an entire generation of women who are doing that double shift and are still, all the evidence shows women are still doing the majority of all of the unpaid caring, managing of relationships, dealing with children, all of that work. So there's a huge amount of work to be done in that space. And it really is, I think, the most vital part of feminism, especially in a context like Australia, is actually about getting men on board with the domestic load and the domestic sphere, and really understanding how much burden that puts on people and what is really required in that space. I don't really know what else. I don't have the solution to it, but I think that's a really important thing that we think about, that feminism is not just about empowering women in the economic sense and in the workplace. It's also about kind of valuing those other more traditional caring roles and giving more prominence and encouraging men to really step into those roles a bit more.
Thanks, Kelly. Just to would you say then, perhaps to connect this to Sita's question, are entry points that you've seen? I know that your work, deals specifically with questions of reproductive health, but what would you see entry points as potentially addressing specifically questions of domestic labor and or of family planning and of reproductive health?
Yeah, look, I mean, we do try and talk about those things. I mean, there is an inherent challenge, I guess, between the point of, you don't want to come in with views and say this is how you should do things. So there is while we say we don't want to impose views, at the same time, if you just said do things the way you've always done them, in a lot of contexts, that would be women stay home and look after children and the men do the job. So there is a kind of, I guess, a balance between those things. But I mean, we do try and encourage things like male involvement in decision-making around family planning. So encouraging men to understand what the benefits are. In Papua New Guinea, we've had quite a lot of success promoting vasectomy, which is really fabulous because there's so many contraceptive methods that are, again, on women, that puts the burden on them to make the decision or be the ones to prevent pregnancy. So we've I guess, made an effort to do some really powerful case studies around men who've got vasectomies, and then asking them to speak about what that's meant for their family or how that's allowed them to look after the children that they already have. And we've got some really strong male nurses who are part of our outreach teams who, have a lot of success, I guess, speaking to other men in the community about, I've had a vasectomy, this is how it changed my life, and kind of giving those examples of how that can really, change the way people think about these things.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kelly. Maybe Thenu, I'll go to you next, if you don't mind. The question both from Sita and from Barty. You can go with whatever direction you want with them.
Yeah, Barty, I'm actually interested in hearing what you found through your research. Is there anything in particular, preliminary findings?
I was focusing on Bangladesh as a case study, and again, wasn't physically there because of COVID, it was just desk research, but I looked at all the different avenues. So I looked at education, I looked at health, I looked at politics, and one of the biggest things is that something we notice around the world in the increase in education doesn't necessarily translate into advancement at work, but more than that, a lot of the economic programs, specifically around microfinance, they didn't include gender transformative programs as well alongside that for social and community behavior change. If they weren't changing that, women would get loans, and then the men would often, it was kind of seen as a second dowry. So so many programs focused on women and empowering women that they were like, oh, if I marry this woman, she will then be able to get a loan and I can start a business. And then often women would get stuck with these loans, and the men would have a business that would fail and the women have to pay them back. And if anyone knows anything about microfinance, it's arranged often in giving circles. And so then other women have to then pick up the pieces to pay back that loan. So it ends up being a burden. Or, there was a case study where in some areas, specifically a lot of roles that men would traditionally play in terms of their involvement in the workforce were starting to decrease, and they were seeing that women were having this focus on them from development actors, and that led to an increase in domestic violence. So again, I was very much focusing on the unintended consequences that were often not measured if you were just looking at the typical indicators from an economic lens. So if you miss on that qualitative data, it's a real challenge for us in the sector.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Super fascinating. And I think speaks to a broader piece about how we measure impact as well. And I think that's something we're really interrogating again at Oaktree about the benefit of taking that more qualitative approach to things. Because like you've said, Barty, there are so many instances where we can miss adverse effects. And I obviously don't have the solution, but I think it's really great that we're starting to think about the ways that traditional modes of thinking need to be challenged in this sector.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Thenu. Alice.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a really fascinating topic, and I think it highlights the risks of seeing anything as a silver bullet. I think microfinance was really presented as like, oh, it's so easy. It's just going to fix gender inequality. We'll just give women a bit of money, and that sort of I think the lessons of the kind of rise and fall of microfinance is really like, be skeptical of a silver bullet. It's not, no one thing is going to solve it on its own, particularly when you're not looking at those broader gender norms. So I think it's really important. And I think it ties to something that I'm aware of the time, so I won't say too much about it, but a really interesting project that we've been working on has been looking at the moment of COVID and how it's changing the trajectories for feminist social change. So it's called Imagining Feminist Futures, and it sort of uses futures thinking tools to try and think about the ways that, COVID is really shaking things up. And unpaid care is such a huge theme in that, the way that COVID has brought to the forefront the amount of unpaid care that gets done and the challenges of balancing that with paid work. And sort of, I think that it's tricky, the COVID moment probably hasn't been as transformative as it could have been. We've in a lot of cases fallen back on old ways of doing things and old paradigms, but I think it really has shown us the things of a capitalist economic system that doesn't, unpaid care is just completely absent from that entire system. The other thing that ties to is how we measure economic empowerment or lack thereof. And I think another piece of work that we've had at IWDA for quite a long time is Equality Insights, which is a multi-dimensional measure of poverty, which, yeah, looks at, you know, finances, but also all these other dimensions: time use, unpaid care, access to SRHR, access to WASH, things like violence against women, you know, a whole range of dimensions, and also looks at differences between men and women within households, which most poverty measures don't do. So I think it's really, oh, great. Yeah, you've heard a little bit about it. I think it's tools like that are increasingly important, I think, in highlighting some of these problems and bringing to the forefront some of the things that are really hidden by other measurements. And then just to segue back to entry points for feminism, I mean, I think sometimes the answer is not to use the word feminism. You know, some of the organizations we work with don't, you know, they talk about gender equality, about human rights. They might, you know, they'll use different kinds of language to kind of open up conversations, because in some contexts, yeah, feminism is just seen as a Western construct that's not relevant, and that's, you know, maybe not compatible with Christian culture or with Muslim culture. It can be kind of put in opposition to those things. So, you know, sometimes the answer is don't say feminism, but just kind of do it, or, you know, use the concepts, but don't use the word. So, you know, it's complicated, but that's one strategy I think that's quite effective.
Excellent. Thank you, Alice. I don't see any other questions currently being asked. And so what I might ask to do, if you still have a question, there's still time to ask it. Although maybe I would ask everyone on the panel, and don't feel compelled if there's nothing to say, but is there some sort of final point or something that you'd like to emphasize before we break for the evening, or even a question that you'd like to ask to somebody else on the panel or in the session right now tonight? What I'm saying is I'd like to leave it to our panel to have the last word here.
Go on, Alice.
I was trying to think of a great question to ask you and Thenu. What's one thing that you would really wish that the development sector would do differently when it comes to focusing on feminism?
You're asking me? Please don't ask
Both
me
of
that.
you, yeah. You can throw it to Thenu.
Go on, Thenu, you have a try.
No, that's such a great question, Alice. And I think it speaks to a lot of the things that we've already brought up today. And for me personally, and I can't speak for other organizations, but giving organizations the space to really take that gendered lens is so important. And I think it doesn't necessarily need to be sector-wide, but if each organization can see the benefits and really invest the time, even though that does mean money in most instances, into taking this approach and realizing that it can maximize impacts in the long run, I think that's something I'd really like to see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, there's so much evidence out there of the benefit of sort of gender equal boards and, you know, in business, that we shouldn't have to be still making this case for the importance of taking this view throughout all the work we do, whether it's in development or in every other sector. But I guess, yeah, we all still need to keep having these conversations. Yeah, I don't know what the development sector could do. I mean, I think there's a lot that our society as a whole could be doing. You know, I'm raising 3 young boys, and you know, there's a lot of eye rolling that I get when I try and raise these questions about who does this or how we talk about certain things. And yeah, I think, you know, gender equality and feminism is going to be a topic we're going to have to keep talking about. I wish it wasn't, but yeah, there's lots of work to still be done across the board.
If I could add one last comment as well, something that I didn't really get to talk about today, but a great interest of mine is intersectionality and how we can look at intersectional feminism as well. And that within the feminist movement, there are very different experiences. And I think we could really, gain as a sector from highlighting the different experiences of women and gender diverse people from across our communities. Yeah.
Thank you, Thenu. I agree completely. So thank you for raising that. If there's no further questions or comments at this point, I appreciate that it is getting late. We're less than an hour and a half away from a new lockdown here in Melbourne. I've been on Zoom for 4 hours today, so I'm starting to lose my voice. But I want to say thank you very much to the presenters for being here this evening. I want to say thank you very much to HAG for helping to organize this session tonight. And I want to say thank you to all of you who have participated as well, have been a part of this, for your questions and for your participation in all this. So my thank you, and if you would please just sort of join me in a virtual or whatever kind of round of applause you can to say thank you to everybody. And again, I would absolutely encourage, the point of these events is to make contacts, to begin to address some of these questions, to meet new people and to reach out. And so I would absolutely encourage you to be in touch with the panel this evening, or with HAG, or with other people that you've seen here in the event this evening. In a better world, we could all sort of move to a nice little reception right now with wine and nibbles, but we don't have that. And so I think actually, as all of our presenters pointed out this evening, well done there. You're gonna have to hustle a little bit to chase after these opportunities. And so I would absolutely encourage our students, if this is an issue that you're passionate about, or it's a sector that you want to work in, to do so. And that's what these events are really sort of about. And we'll have our next one, the Industry Engagement and Career Session on the 2nd of September. And then we'll have the next professional practice seminar on decolonizing international development, which I think, overlaps with many of the discussions that we've had tonight, particularly around questions of power and development and power relationships. So these will be ongoing themes that we'll continue to address across the semester. So unless there's anything else somebody wants to add, I think we are nearly done for the evening.
I'd just like to thank you, Jeff. Thanks for moderating this panel tonight. That was great. And yeah, brilliant panelists. Thank you so much. I mean, you've all mentioned that you didn't have any answers, but you certainly gave us a lot to think about. So yeah, thanks a lot, Jeff, too.
Definitely. Thank you all. And hopefully we'll see you in real life before too long.
Indeed. Thanks for the invitation to participate.
Yeah,
it's lovely to
thanks
meet
so
you all.
much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.